his legacy had been cut in two, so he spent hours talking to me that he never would have had I known him at the height of his power. And I think I'd like to believe that that privilege fired within me that drive to somehow understand the inner person, to look empathetically at my subjects instead of just yelling at them the way I was doing with LBJ when I was in the anti-war movement. Not that he changed my mind about the war, but he changed my mind about how I felt about him. And I'd like to believe I brought that understanding. Not that you wouldn't be critical of what your different presidents did, but you're not looking at them from the outside, but hopefully from the inside out.
No one in my family ever went to college before. My mother and her family grew up in Central Virginia, and they were farmers who basically lived off the land. My father, with 5 sisters, a brother, his mother, and assorted relatives who came and went, grew up in the poorest of mining towns in West Virginia, in a 2-room house, 1 bedroom, and 1 room with a wood-burning stove. When my grandmother, his mother, couldn't always take care of him, he spent part of his life in an orphanage. They were good people, but there wasn't much conversation in my house as I was growing up about going to college. The idea that if you had said to me, when I was a teenager unsure of my future, that I would spend part of my life with presidents and prime ministers and great achievers of all kinds, I may have questioned your sanity. But as the events of my life unfolded, I learned something very special about life. Our lives, yours and mine, are comprised of turning points, forks in the road. These forks in the road are our defining moments and our powerful influences in life. They're the people who come into our lives, moments in time that we experience, and unexpected events. These turning points, or forks in the road, are what define our success and achievement more than any other set of lessons that you'll ever hear. When I was 16 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to be in life. I had a mentor in high school. He was a teacher. He was the athletic director. He was the football coach at my school. Everyone looked up to him. He was that teacher you want to have. He encouraged me to be the first in my family to go to college. In fact, he inspired me. I wanted to be just like him. So I graduated from the university with a degree in education, and I went back to the junior high school that I attended years earlier to become a teacher there and their football coach. When the opportunity arose, I went back to college to get a master's degree, and upon graduation, I became the intramural director of the university, which meant I was in charge of the recreation for the general population of students. When the university built a new field house, I was hired to become the assistant athletic director. 5 years after becoming the assistant athletic director, the old-time athletic director announced his retirement, and I was offered his job. This was my dream job. I had far exceeded the expectations of that 16-year-old boy who may or may not have ever gone to college. And then, to the surprise of my friends and the shock of the colleagues at the university, I quit and walked away. About the same time, I had a friend of mine send me a copy of Fortune magazine. In the magazine, there was a story about the Harry Walker Agency, which at the time was the largest lecture agency in the world. In the article, the author recounts how Harry Walker walks into the Gerald Ford White House and signs Alexander Haig, Gerald Ford, and Henry Kissinger as clients. Near the end of the article, the author quotes Henry Kissinger as complaining about the 33% commission rate that Harry Walker wanted to charge, and saying to Harry Walker, why don't I simply sign with one of your competitors? Harry Walker's response, I have no competitors. So I took the magazine home and I left it at the coffee table. And days later I came home and my wife said, have you read this article? He has no competitors. So she sat me down and she said, you know, you come home 2 or 3 times a week and you complain about the bureaucracy of university life. I don't think you're ever going to be happy until you can make decisions on your own. So over a period of weeks, she pushed me and prodded me and convinced me to drop and quit my dream job. We had no plan. We had no experience. We had no money. We had a 1-year-old boy, baby boy. So to start our new agency and to have money to live on, we put a second mortgage on our home. Now we had $55,000 of mortgages on a $60,000 house at above 12% interest rate. We didn't want to allocate money for an office, so a friend of ours offered to rent us his stationery closet. His name was Chuck Hagel, and Chuck would later become a United States Senator and the Secretary of Defense for Barack Obama. Now, to give you an idea what it's like to start work in Chuck Hagel's stationery closet, if we wanted to leave the closet for any reason, we had to wait for one of Chuck's meetings to be over. Because you see, you had to go from our closet through Chuck's office to get out. Now, to give you an idea what it's like to start a speaker's bureau in the closet, we would sit there and think of famous names. We would try to get a telephone number or an address. Nobody ever returned our telephone calls, and our letters were returned from lawyers who said, my client, this famous person, is under a written contract with another agency. Don't write him again or we'll sue you. Now, we got to remember, back in 1980, there was no internet. So the very first time we discovered there were 5 or 6 large agencies, in addition to Harry Walker, up and down the East Coast. Harry Walker's claim of no competition was nothing more than a strategic boast. I remember I used to sit in that closet late at night, and I'd put my head in my hand and I would think to myself, what have we done? 12 months passes, a full year, and nothing has changed. We're still in the closet. Harry Walker still controls the industry. There were 5 or 6 large agencies now, competition we did not know existed when we first started, and we didn't represent anyone. The only thing that had changed really was we were about out of money. Another 2 months passes, and I get a call from a guy named Steve Bell. Steve was the news anchorman for a news show that started in 1975 called Good Morning America. I had briefly met Steve when I was at the university. Steve had been under one of those written contracts. The contract had expired and they hadn't done a good job for him. He discovered that we had started a lecture agency, so he called me and invited me over. I asked Steve if we could represent him and he agreed, and we shook hands. On the drive back from his office, it suddenly struck me that I didn't sign him to a contract. So I get back to the closet and I tell Paula, my wife, I said, I tried to justify it by saying, well, what good would it do to hold him to a piece of paper if he was unhappy? That mistake on my part, that error in judgment, became a defining moment for us. Because Steve went then and told his friends, other Washington journalists, that if you don't want to sign a written contract with an agency, you can go with this new little guys in town, shake their hand, and walk out on them anytime you want. Suddenly, we were very popular. 2 years passes, and we represent about 6 of those well-known Washington journalists. I get a telephone call from Alex Haley, the great author of Roots. Alex says, Bernie, I'd like to come and see you. And I said, sure, when would you like to come? And he said, look out your window. And I looked down and he's waving to me from a phone booth. Alex comes upstairs and we instantly bonded. I shook his hand and we agreed to represent him. Over a period of months, in fact, years, Alex would come back to my office and he would sit there for 2 hours at a time and he would talk about family and relationships. He used to repeat a phrase to me, when an old person dies, it's like a library burning. That pithy phrase stuck with me, and as time went by, I began to understand what he was saying to me. Our lives are like the pages in a book. Those experiences are the pages in a book. And these are the turning points in our lives, the powerful influences, the defining moments. They're the people who come into our lives, the unexpected events, the moments in time. These turning points, these forks in the road, more than anything else, define our success. Successful people have learned how to navigate, recognize, and successfully make good decisions about these turning points. I think you will see yourself in many of the stories in this book. Tom Brokaw, great journalist who's been at NBC for 50 years, fails out of college twice. What separated Tom from the rest of us who fail in life? Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, 5'1", is bullied all of his young life. His life takes a 180-degree turn because of the death of a young boy who used to protect him. What separated his life from the lives of those who were bullied in school? Liz Murray. Liz is a child of drug-addicted parents who goes homeless on the streets and the subways of New York City, only to scratch her way back to high school and attend Harvard. What separated Liz's life from the many others who are homeless in America today? And Doris Kearns Goodwin, the great historian. Doris writes an article calling for the defeat of the re-election of the President of the United States during the Vietnam War. That article is published just before she takes an internship at the White House. And yet, her friendship with that president changed her life and career. What separated Doris's life from the rest of us who shut doors and leave them shut? Would you please welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin? All right, Doris.
Yes.
You've had a couple well-known turning points in your life, and one of them came when you were very young, and it stayed with you all of your life. And it had to do with your dad and your mom. So could you tell us all a little about that?
Oh, I'd be glad to. I think that's what makes Bernie's book so interesting, is that that's the personal story that each one of these people told. You sometimes think of these people out there, as you say, successful, and know that so many of them, including myself, went through adversity and had to have the resilience to come through it and hopefully become stronger. What Bernie's referring to is that my mother had had rheumatic fever when I was a child, so she had the arteries, the doctor said, of an 80-year-old when she was only 30 years old, and had a series of heart attacks when I was young. And it kept her in the house as an invalid, but it meant that she read books in every spare moment she could find, and every night she would read to me, though she had only an 8th grade education. And I loved listening to her voice, so much softer than mine. Mine was so loud you could hear me on the neighborhood wherever I was, still tends to be that way. And the only thing I loved more than listening to her read a book to me was somehow listening to stories about the days when she was young and healthy, because I somehow began to imagine what would it have been like for you when you could skip rope, when you could jump around the street in the ways that she couldn't now. So I wanted to hear about her when she was young, and imagining that if I could keep her talking about the days when she was young and healthy, her mind would control her body. and she would stop this premature aging process. She'd go backwards. So I would constantly say to her, Mom, tell me a story about you when you were my age, not realizing how peculiar that was until I had my own 3 sons, who never once said to me, Doris, Mom, tell me a story about you when you were our age. But I think those nights of listening to her stories gave within me that desire to tell stories, to keep somebody's memory alive. She died when I had just turned 15 years old, but somehow all those stories that she told me and the listening to her reading books has kept her memory and her life alive for me ever since. On my father's side, he had had a very tough childhood. He had been orphaned when he was 10 years old, and yet if you knew him, he had the most outgoing, contagious optimism personality. And if there's anything I'd like to believe as a gift he gave to me, it was somehow if you're good to people, they'll be good to you. And you never would have known when you saw his sparkling green eyes. Michael Francis Aloysius Kearns, very Irish, needless to say. And he loved baseball. So I was the 3rd daughter, so I became the one who became his baseball kid. And we lived in Long Island. He worked in Brooklyn at that time, and he'd come home on the train, and he had taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games so that I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And then he'd come home, and I was so excited with all these miniaturized symbols. I would tell him every single play of every inning of the game that had just taken place that afternoon, not realizing that he probably had known what had happened all along. He made me feel I was telling him this fabulous piece of history, which makes you think there's something magic about history. I'm convinced this is where my love of history came, besides listening to my mother tell stories. Even if history is only 5 hours old, your father's listening to you. And I realize now that I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions with my dad, because at first I'd be so excited I would blurt out, the Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost, which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Much later read an essay by my heroine, Barbara Tuchman, who said, even if you're writing about a war as a narrative historian, you have to imagine to yourself you don't know how that war ended. So you can carry a reader with you every step along the way from beginning to middle to end. So in some ways I just learned that instinctively with my dad, who made it even more special for me when I was only 6. He never told me then that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. But there's no question that those days with my father and that love of baseball that he imprinted in me stayed with me the rest of my life, making me an irrational fan of baseball. When the Dodgers abandoned us to go to Los Angeles, I then moved to Harvard and became an equally irrational Red Sox fan. And though my father died before I got married and had my sons, there are times when I can go to Fenway Park now and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below. Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider. There's magic in these moments, because I know when I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel that loyalty and love that's linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never had a chance to see, but I'd like to believe whose heart and soul they have come to know through the stories I have told. So I really think through those personal experiencing, storytelling became, for me, not just an academic profession, but something that I wanted to pass on so that the stories of the people I've lived with, you know, whether it's Franklin Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, I sometimes wonder what I'm doing living with dead presidents all my life. The only worry I have about it is that someday there'll be a panel of all the presidents I've ever studied, and every single one will be telling me every single thing I got wrong about them. And the first person to scream out, of course, will be Lyndon Johnson. How come that damn book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book you wrote about me? But nonetheless, that desire to tell stories became, I think, the root of my becoming an historian.
So you went to college, and obviously Vietnam War was going on, so there was a lot of opinions in one way and opinions in another way. It was a very unsettling time in the country. And you end up writing an article. You didn't know really, I guess, it would be published. Right. You had written it a little while before you were about to become a White House Fellow. And tell us the story about how the article got published and what was the reaction of the administration when they read it.
So what happened is I was actually a graduate student at Harvard here at the time, and a friend of mine and I, we were involved, as so many young people were, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, had been involved in marches in New York and in Boston. And we wrote an article together about how to remove Lyndon Johnson from power, with this idealistic idea that if women and poor people and minorities got together, we could somehow undo Lyndon Johnson. And we sent it to the New Republic and heard nothing. Not surprisingly, when I look at the article sometimes, I wonder. However, I was nominated for a White House fellowship, and in that same spring that we had previously written the article of '67, and I got we had a dance at the White House the night we were selected. President Johnson did dance with me. It wasn't that peculiar because there are only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows, but as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But then that was not to happen right away, because 2 days later, suddenly the New Republic publishes this article with that title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, or even more worrisome, just abolish the entire program. That's the kind. So White House Fellows is fabulous. It still exists. It's a bipartisan program. Between 24 and 40, you can become a White House Fellow. You work for a cabinet officer or for the White House itself. But surprisingly, he said, when everybody said, what are we going to do with her? Oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I didn't get to work for him right away. I was in the Labor Department, but then he resigned from office in '68 and called me up right away and said, okay, you said I should be removed. I've removed myself. Now you have to work for me the rest of the time. So I ended up staying with him the rest of my fellowship, and then staying the rest of his term until he left to go back to the ranch, and then going to the ranch to help him on his memoirs the last years of his life. I'm not sure I ever fully understood why he spent so much time with me. I'd like to believe it was because I was a good listener, and he was a great storyteller, so I loved listening to it. He could mimic people. He was funny. He was colorful. He was crude. And I think I liked listening to his stories, even though I found out later that half of them weren't true. I think that was part of his attraction for me, that I liked listening to the tall tales. But I also worried part of it was that I was then a young woman, and he had somewhat of a minor league womanizing reputation, so I was constantly talking to him about boyfriends, even when I had none at all. Everything working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous when he took me nearby to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Baines Johnson, and there was wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings, and he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing given what was going on in my mind. But I must say, the older I've gotten, the more I realized what an incredible privilege it was to have spent so many hours with this aging lion of a man. I mean, here he was, a victor in 1,000 contests. And I look at it now, 50 years later, and the war gets into a different perspective. I think it'll always be a scar in his legacy. But nonetheless, what he did in civil rights, what he did with Medicare, what he did for age education, for voting rights, it deserves enormous honor, as does his ability to deal with Congress, something that nobody's been quite able to do since then. So I'm so glad that at least his daughters have been able to see that renaissance in some ways in his reputation. And for me, I saw him in the sad days when he was lonely, when he was so upset with the thought that his legacy had been cut in two. So he spent hours talking to me that he never would have had I known him at the height of his power. And I think I'd like to believe that that privilege fired within me that drive to somehow understand the inner person, to look empathetically at my subjects instead of just yelling at them the way I was doing with LBJ when I was in the anti-war movement. Not that he changed my mind about the war, but he changed my mind about how I felt about him. And I'd like to believe I brought that understanding. Not that you wouldn't be critical of what your different presidents did, but you're not looking at them from the outside, but hopefully from the inside out, as I moved from LBJ to JFK, from JFK to FDR, from FDR to Lincoln, and finally to Teddy and Taft. Yep. So that was a huge turning point. I would have been an historian. I was getting my PhD here at Harvard in Supreme Court history. So I would have been studying those guys with the robes, and I don't think it would have been much fun as studying these crazy characters that become our presidents.
So you mentioned Lincoln, and you know that the great movie that was done on Lincoln based on your book. What can you tell us about that?
It was an incredible experience. I mean, I think the thing about writing is that writing is a more isolating kind of life. And once I got married and had the kids, I couldn't teach anymore. So I was writing. Luckily, my husband's a writer, so we write in different parts of the houses. But the thing about a movie is that there's a camaraderie. It's a group project. And Spielberg allowed me to be a part of every stage of the process. So from the very beginning, he had 2 scripts written before the final script that Tony Kushner wrote of the movie that became Lincoln. And those scripts I looked at, and they were really good. But Daniel Day-Lewis had not said he would be Lincoln with either of those scripts. And he just had his heart set, Spielberg did, on making Daniel Lincoln. So finally, when the book came out, he had bought the rights to the book when I was only halfway done, because he just wanted to do a movie on Lincoln so much. And finally the book came out, and then Tony wrote the script, and Daniel said yes. So as soon as Daniel said yes, Daniel living then in Ireland, Spielberg called me up and said he was going to send his plane for Daniel and me, and he wanted me to take him, if I would, to Springfield, Illinois, because when he is becoming whatever character he is, Daniel Day-Lewis has to live it for a year. So he'd made Spielberg promise, you won't do this movie for a year, I have to become Lincoln. So he wanted to start by going to see the State House and Lincoln's house with Mary and the places where his law offices were. But he didn't want anybody to know that he was being Lincoln yet, because he wanted to keep it surprise. And more than that, just wanted Daniel to have room to become Lincoln. So he was coming under an assumed name. I had to tell all the tour guides, just pretend you don't know who he is, and you're just going to eat in the hotel. So that night, we'd already become friends on the plane. So I said, so we're just eating in the hotel, right? And he says, no, let's go to a bar. So we went to a bar, and immediately somebody bought us drinks. I think, oh my God, it's over. But the weird thing was they didn't recognize him, they recognized me. So that became a huge joke between us, because Daniel just looks like whoever he is, so it's not like he's the kind of person you'd pick out immediately. So that became part of a joke between us, and then for an entire year, I would send him books to read. He was reading about Webster and Calhoun and Henry Clay, and yet, when I went down to the filming in Richmond, Virginia, I couldn't see him on the set. He wouldn't allow anybody who knew him, including his wife, to ever watch him, because he couldn't come out of character. Even the other actors had to call him Mr. President or Mr. Lincoln. So I didn't get to see him when I went down to the set. I saw other scenes that were being filmed. I never saw my old friend Daniel until the premieres in LA and New York. So when we went to New York, he said, okay, he was living in New York by then. He said, we have to go to a bar to remember the first bar in Springfield. So his favorite bar is the Carlisle in New York, and he has this favorite drink, an old Cuban, which is made up of God knows what. But anyway, he had a few of them, and I had just 2 of them, which is an important part of the story. Everything was fine. I go back, etc. And then he starts winning the first of his series of awards, and Steven Spielberg comes to give him the first one in New York at the New York Circle Critics Award. And he talks about how many times he had rejected the role, and he wrote these beautiful letters, which Stephen read, saying that the script is really lovely, but it's just not me, until he finally accepted. So then Daniel gets up there, and unfortunately there was a Wall Street Journal reporter in the room to carry this the next day. He said, I don't reject everything. When Doris Kearns Goodwin asked me to go binge drinking with her, I accepted it once. So I was proud to have that in the newspaper the next day. But it was a great experience, and just as I say, I got to be involved with the production design people. When I saw the recreation of the Lincoln White House, it was so beautifully done, and got to go to all the awards up to the Academy Award. But the more important part of it was, I think, just being part of a group experience. So it was really sad when it was over, because it was also the end of Lincoln for me. It had stretched Lincoln for another 4 or 5 years. But then happily, Spielberg bought the rights to Teddy and Taft. And so that's being developed, hopefully right now, into what will probably be an HBO movie.
Yeah. The amazing thing about your story and a lot of other stories of people I got to know was, it's easy for us. Yogi Berra, and I hate to even mention Yogi Berra in Boston, but Yogi Berra once said, I get to a fork in the road and I take it. and that, unfortunately, that's what most of us, we end up doing. We don't realize that there are forks in the road. We don't see those decisions. We kind of like pass by them. And I think the key to, if not success, especially accomplishment and happiness, is the idea that we all need to slow down a little bit and take a look at those crossroads, those forks in the road that we get to, and make good and wise decisions. I mean, my life was a series of just fortunate mistakes. I mean, I had no idea I was making good decisions on which path to take. I listened to a mentor in high school, and he took me in one direction for 17 years. I get to my dream job, something that I had aspired to for all that time. And my wife, because of a magazine article, convinces me to walk away. And I listen because maybe she knows something that I don't know. Maybe there's some reason for me to change my life. And then we sit in that closet, and at the last minute, we get a phone call. I make a mistake. And that mistake is an honest mistake. I mean, you know, who wouldn't want to just shake hands with somebody and keep your word? But then it turns out to be a defining moment that we would have probably been out of business. Then when you have success in life, I think the thing about success in life is that when you're not used to it, which we were not used to it, there's a temptation to make it go faster. And in my life, you know, we got to a certain point and I was anxious for more success. I mean, we'd had a little success, but you know, those 5 or 6 agencies that existed and Harry Walker were still, after several years, far above us. And so I'm trying to think of what to do. And those handshakes, I said, you know, nobody else did those handshakes. So why don't you just stop worrying about people walking out on you, tie people up, and just start signing a lot of people and tie them up, but you'd have been like everybody else. So around the same time, there's a football coach who went to Notre Dame, and we were interested in representing him. His name was Lou Holtz, and no one had been able to sign Lou. So I read in the Washington Post that Lou was coming to meet with Ronald Reagan in the White House. So I sent a letter to Lou and I said, Lou, would you stop by? We'd like to meet you. Now we only have Paul is working in the office, I'm working, we have our business partner, and we have maybe 2 secretaries. That is it. So there was no way to say it with, you know, so Lou would understand that we really cared, because all these other agencies had made an effort to sign Lou. So I just simply said, Lou, would you allow us to represent you? And Lou says, I will, let me think about it. About a month later, I get a letter from Lou, and Lou says, I have 2 inboxes on my desk. One is for football, and one is for speeches. And my speech inbox is twice as big as my football inbox, and therefore, I will accept your invitation.
Wow.
Now, that's lucky timing. So at the bottom of the letter, Lou says, I will do so on 3 conditions. Now, you can easily dismiss this, as you do with turning points. Lou says, as long as I can trust you, as long as you care about me, and are you committed to excellence? I remember putting the letter on my desk and ready to file it away. And it stayed there for a day, and then it stayed there for several days. And I couldn't think of myself, why in the world am I not putting this letter away? Then I picked it up, and it said, do you care about me? Are you committed to excellence? Are you committed to excellence? Do you care about me?
Can I trust you?
Yes, can I trust you? Just the very reasons that we had started the agency in the first place. And it came just at a time when I was ready to get rid of the handshakes, cut corners, raise commission, do whatever I can to find quicker success. And what I learned, what he taught me at the moment, because I happened to pay attention, and for some reason in my head I could not file it away, he taught me that success, long-term success, takes time and takes doing it right. And I have one other quick story, if you can bear with me for a second. Our big turning point came with Ronald Reagan. We were, in 1988, we were kind of still in the middle of the pack. I mean, there were a lot of agencies above us, but Ronald Reagan was leaving office, and the White House sent us a letter saying, would you like to come and interview to represent him? And there were 30 different agencies invited. All of the Hollywood agencies had been invited because he was an actor in Hollywood. And so the idea you would do one set of interviews, take the 30 and go down to 15, do another set of interviews, go down to 7, and then they would present the top 2 choices to the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan to make the final decision. So the interviews ended in the middle of December, and a couple weeks goes by, and you're getting anxious. And in Washington, it's a very gossipy town. If you want to know something about what's going on in Washington, you can call somebody, they'll find out what's going on. But for 2 months, nothing. Never heard a word. And none of the other agencies heard anything either. I get a phone call in the middle of February, and it's Fred Ryan, who's now the publisher of the Washington Post, but at the time he was the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan. And I remember sitting at my desk thinking, I said, this is it. And then I started thinking, envisioning what he was going to say to me. And He said, I had this idea, Bernie, you guys have done a really good job, and you should be proud of what you've accomplished in 9 years, but we need to go with somebody more experienced. I mean, after all, nobody in Washington, D.C. thought we would ever represent Ronald Reagan. And so I picked up the phone, braced myself for the bad news, and he says, Bernie, President and Mrs. Reagan have selected you to represent him. I had no idea what to say. So I said, thank you, we'll do a real good job, I'll be in touch, and hung up the phone. And so I'm sitting at my desk that day, and I remember thinking how totally amazing it felt that a president of the United States would trust his legacy to a group of totally inexperienced people. But as the years went by and I got to know him, I understood how it all happened. He was basically a small town boy who believed in entrepreneurism and the little guy. And he was guided by those powerful influences and defining moments that years before Alex Haley tried to have me understand. So I just wanted to share those two with you. So, and I think we'd be glad to take questions.
Absolutely, right? About anything you want.
The question I would have is characteristics of greatness. Can you kind of put a few characteristics that kind of a lot of the people that you represent or that you've written about share?
Why don't you start? Because
well, it's interesting because what I finally decided for my next book, it's going to be about leadership. I mean, I don't want to spend another 10 years finding yet another president that will take me forever. It took me twice as long to write about FDR as it did World War II to be fought. It took me twice as long as the Civil War to write about Lincoln, 7 years to write about Teddy and Taft. So I realized that underneath all of these books, there was a beginning understanding of what did these leaders share and what were the qualities that made them successful leaders. So I'm just taking Lincoln and Teddy and Franklin and LBJ and answering hopefully that question, does the man make the times or the times make the man? Because obviously the challenges that you're provided at the time, it depends on whether it hits your temperament or not. But I do think there are qualities that even though things change so much over time, that really do stay on. And obviously character is one of the hugest ones of those, in the sense of how you comport yourself. Do you create a team where you share credit with that team, where you take responsibility for failure, where you make the team morale feel part of what they're working on, where they feel they're making a difference? Are you able to have people around you who can question your assumptions and argue with you? Obviously, Team of Rivals is the symbolic example of that, but even other examples where FDR had Eleanor around him who could always question what he was doing, even as he said she was a welcome thorn in his side. And then there's the ability, interestingly, what you were saying, I think a central ability of leadership is that ability to self-reflect, to look at your mistakes and learn from them and grow from them. Lincoln liked to say, he liked to believe when he went through his mistakes that he was smarter today than he was yesterday because he thought about them. He would write about them. What did I do wrong? And then he figured out so that he might not do the same thing twice again. So that's the ability to communicate, whether it's Lincoln in the time of a written word, where the written word is king, or it's Teddy Roosevelt at the time when the national newspapers are coming and he's got that punchy language that is perfect for the national newspapers. And FDR has the right voice for the radio at his time. I loved a story that I found at one point where somebody said they were going home, a construction worker, and the other guy said, well, where are you going? He said, well, my president's coming to speak to me in my living room tonight, so it's only right that I be there to hear him. And then, of course, JFK and Reagan have the television world at the time of the three networks, magically dealt with. And then we have social media today, which has helped to produce Donald Trump. So the changes in communication and how you communicate make a difference. The ability, this also, when you were saying you just keep succeeding, but you want to stop and slow down a little bit, all of my guys figured out how to relax and replenish their energy, something that's much harder in today's world with cell phones and Facebook, et cetera. Lincoln went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on for a few precious hours, he could imagine he was back in Shakespeare's War of the Roses and not in his own. And he would always relax with a funny story. He could tell the funniest story in the middle of the worst days of the war, and the cabinet would have to finally just laugh and relax for a few minutes. When Daniel and Spielberg were making the movie, I made them promise they would tell my favorite Lincoln story, which had to do with the Revolutionary War hero Ethan Allen. As Lincoln told the story, Mr. Allen went to England right after the war. The British are still upset about losing the Revolution. They decide to embarrass him at a dinner party by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the only outhouse where he's going to have to encounter it sooner or later. But he comes out not upset at all. They think he's going to be really upset about the indignity of George Washington in an outhouse. And they say, well, didn't you see George Washington there? He said, oh, yes, he said. I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him. What do you mean, they said? Well, he said, there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington. So you can imagine if you tell a story like that in the middle of a bad time, people will relax for a moment. Teddy Roosevelt went and spent 2 hours every afternoon in a raucous game of tennis or a wrestling match or a boxing match so that he could just feel like his energy was being replenished. FDR had a cocktail hour every night in the White House, where the rule was during World War II, you couldn't talk about the war. You could gossip, you could talk about books you'd read, movies you'd seen, as long as the war didn't come up. And after a while, that cocktail hour was so important to him that he wanted his closest friends to be living in the White House. So the White House became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. They're all living on the second floor. And I think that ability to not just keep moving forward, but take time to reflect, and as you say, to take time to enjoy what's happening to you, all my guys had that.
Yeah, I think, and the things that you write and the stories that, you know, of the people that I've represented, the interesting thing is that these stories, you know, people my age know these people. But what I wrote this book for were for kids today who are, and kids 40 years and younger, who just don't have good examples anymore beyond social media personalities. They just don't find these, and we tend not to slow down. As you say, we don't tend to slow down. I could have gone in many different directions unless I paid attention to Lou Holtz's letter. Right. And the unique thing is, I innocently shook somebody's hand and gave them my word and was upset with myself because I wasn't going to tie that word to a piece of paper. The company I built was in an industry that's not that great, you know, and our growth from that closet to 9 years later to the biggest in the world was quite an accomplishment for us. But it was all in that handshake. That handshake created an aura of, surprisingly, an aura of trust, because everybody we've represented over 30-some years has been on a handshake. Every president, prime minister, everybody. I've never had a contract with anybody. And somebody asked me, I was on Sirius Radio last night, and somebody said, well, you got to have a lot of bad people that you don't like or are difficult to get along with. And my point was, if you treat people well, if you have certain principles that you live up to, they're going to treat you well in return. And so, I mean, it's a simple thing to learn, but as I said earlier, you know, I came from a place where, you know, my family was never going to go to college, and despite being good people, I could have ended up never experiencing this. And this is every person I represent. It's like a book for me. And thanks to Alex Haley opening my eyes and Ronald Reagan proving it to be true.
Great.
So this will most probably sound familiar. He cannot speak good grammar, and whose speeches are illiterate compositions. His speeches are illiterate compositions interlarded with coarse and clumsy jokes. He has most unwarrantedly abused the privilege which all politicians have of being ugly. So that was written in 1860 by the news media. It sounds very familiar. Can you give some perspective on what people said about Lincoln?
No, I think it's an important thing to realize, because when a person becomes an icon, you forget where they had to not just start from his earlier life, but what people thought about him when he was first elected. In fact, there are moments when, you know, when he himself could laugh at people saying how ugly he was. He knew that he had good grammar. I mean, he had educated himself. He had only 12 full months of schooling, but he had read poetry, he had read literature. Literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings. But until he was in the presidency for a little while, people who knew him in Illinois knew that he was a special person. They knew well beyond exactly the quotes that you're giving, but the general American public really had very little sense of him. So it took time for that to be developed. When FDR first became president, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, well, he had a first-class temperament, but a second-class intellect. And many people thought he was just a playboy from a privileged background. So that's where the whole man in the moment comes in. There's no question that Lincoln, having been through so much adversity in his life, was exactly the right man to take us through the darkest days of the war. There's no question that FDR, whatever people thought about his over-optimistic personality, that contagious optimism was exactly right to be the person to get us through the Depression and later through the war. And so I think it's important for you to, as you brought up though, to realize that we do have attitudes towards, and maybe that's a hopeful thing for today. I don't know, but people's perceptions have to develop over time as we see them in the presidency. The only thing I'd say is that I don't think people change fundamentally when they become president. I think from what I see that their strengths may become stronger, their weaknesses may show themselves more, and they may have a chance, like Abigail Adams said, that great necessities create great leaders in a certain way, so that if there's some big challenge, it's easier to mobilize the country together. But I don't think we can expect any fundamental change when a person becomes president. Lincoln was already a good man before he became a great man. FDR was already an extraordinary character before we understood it. So I think that's an important thing to realize.
I think the problem with politicians is that we see ourselves adjusting and changing and making good decisions in life. And it's disturbing when we don't see it for people that are supposed to be serving us as well.
Yeah, I think there's a real worry about who the people are that are now going into public life. I think the combination of having to spend so much time raising funds, I think the campaign money that we have to spend is the poison in the system. You add to that people running in for public office today know that their private lives will be exposed to public view, that the districts are such that you can't be a moderate, you have to be one or the other. It's making it less likely, I think, that our best people want to go into public life, especially when they look at the last couple decades at a Congress that can't get anything done. So it's really important, I think, for that younger generation right now to remember that I still think public life is extraordinary. I still think the chances, if you go into political life, of doing something that makes a difference are great. You're going to see different aspects of everybody's lives if you're a politician. We have to restore that sense. I personally believe that what we need in the country is some sort of national service program so that people from different classes and different races and different religions can get together. My son served in the Army right after 9/11. He'd gone to Harvard, just graduated in 2001, joined the Army. He said nothing will ever equal what it was like to have that platoon that he led, earned a Bronze Star from all different parts of the country. And he said you learn how a common mission can bring people together. Then he got called back to Afghanistan, but now he's really arguing that some sort of national service for kids is what's necessary to bring people together so that these class and cultural lines that are polarizing the country can begin to be diminished.
Yeah, the thing you may not know is that these congressmen and senators spend hours a day traveling over to their either Democratic or Republican headquarters, which are only a block away from where they are, and they're required to sit there and fundraise. And the only way they can raise money is if they have an issue. That's why we keep revisiting all these issues over and over again, because you can't let go of an issue and then collect money. So, so if you listen to people, nobody comes up with solutions. It's always what the other guy is doing badly. I mean, it was interesting because I was listening to television today, and somebody says, well, how is this politician going to be able to win? Are they really going to handle details? And the answer was, well, yeah, that person's coming out with details. They're detailing how the other side is doing it very badly. Well, that's the answer. There's no real solutions being offered because they need the money.
So that's why I feel that a lot of people that don't understand the what do you call it, the generation, that that's always into the media, the millennials. And I think the media and the internet is a leveler for them. So, and I talk to all kinds of people. I talk to the young people, so I don't know where, and the media portrays them so badly. And I don't think that's right. You know, they do want to get involved, and I see it all the time. They're younger than me, you know, and they just keep, by the media, they just keep getting pounded on and pounding on. And then they have these college loans that they can't pay off. So the media is very powerful. Their cell phones, I'm so glad they have them, because it is a leveler. So they'll know what you're doing and what the folks in Washington are doing and what are the solutions. Real solutions is what we need.
Right. Good for you. That's a very different point of view, and I think that's right. I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think what we forget is that a lot of young people are active in their local areas. They're active in causes they care about. And I think we're seeing it even more now. There seems to be a rise of the citizenry and young people. It could really, every change that we've had in America, the really important changes come from the bottom up. I mean, as somebody wrote as an historian, the revolution was won in the hearts and the minds of the people before the first shot was won. The anti-slavery movement was essential before the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. The progressive movement preceded Teddy Roosevelt, and obviously the civil rights movement made the civil rights legislation and LBJ happen. So I think you're right. I think there's a sense of they're just selfish, they're on their cell phones all day long, but I've been out with young people right now, and I think even now more than ever before, that's what we have to look for if we're older. They got to do it.
Right.
They have their own rendezvous with destiny now.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, we've certainly enjoyed the political discussion tonight, and you're both biographers of sorts, and I just am fascinated by biography because it always drags so much history of the times along with those people. But I think that since Wait Till Next Year is over there, it does give me license to ask a baseball question. And Doris, you were so wonderful in Ken Burns' baseball story, and it was just great. But I just wanted to ask you, two teams, Dodgers, Red Sox, can you articulate your favorite player on each team and why?
I sure can. I think there's no question that for the Dodgers, it was Jackie Robinson, and I'd like to believe it was because I was a young civil rights person, but it was more, to be honest, because he was so exciting on the base pass. Every time he got to first base, he would steal second, and then he'd steal third, and the pitcher would get all rattled, and I loved watching him. Finally, I always wanted his autograph, and in those days, you could get their autographs without paying for them, but his line was always too long, so I never waited for him until finally I was probably 12 or something, and girls, maybe some of you older people like me will remember this, we used to have these idiotic autograph books where we'd have these little sayings like, I will love you till Niagara Falls, or I will cherish you till rubber tires.
I had a couple of those.
Oh. Anyway, I brought my autograph book with me, and I got to the front of the line, and I thought he'll just sign and look like my intimate friend, but he started reading the autograph book. I thought I was going to faint. And then he looks at me and he says, well, I see I'm in good company. And he wrote, in complete keeping with the spirit of the autograph book, keep your smile a long, long while, Jackie Robinson. It was great. And then years later, his wife, his widow, Rachel Robinson, got an award from Eleanor Roosevelt's Institute, and I got to introduce her for the award. So then I thought, oh my God, if my father had only been alive to see me talking to Rachel Robinson about my crush on Jackie Robinson, it would have been amazing. So I think there's no question today, like so many other people, there was something about Big Papi. Oh God, we miss him already this year. But that spirit and that just coming through at those critical moments, knowing, we now think how incredible it was that he'd get a home run just when you needed him to, but what pressure there was on him each time he came up, because people are thinking you're going to do it, and most of the time he's not going to do it. And there was just a joy of baseball, a joy of living. He played like a little boy still, unlike so many of the others. So I would say Jackie and Big Papi are the two.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Who said we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars? You know that? That's Oscar Wilde. I like to say usually that between Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Mark Twain, and possibly Woody Allen, they said all the one-liners that are worth saying, and the rest is, you know, just repetition. It's a bit like Alfred North Whitehead once, philosopher and mathematician, once wrote that all of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato.